Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're diving deep into medieval Spain, a really pivotal and often quite surprising chapter in history. Just try to picture a land caught between two immense forces, the Cross and the Crescent. For centuries, really from 756 AD right up to 1031, the Iberian Peninsula wasn't just shaped by conquest. It was forged in this dynamic interplay of cultures and beliefs, a complex and truly silent struggle for Spain's own identity.
That's exactly right. And this isn't just a story about battles, though conflict was certainly a constant undercurrent. It's more a profound exploration of how identity shifted, how ideas intertwined, and the subtle, often unseen ways civilizations adapt and transform when they're brought into such close, prolonged contact. Our lens for this deep dive is drawn from the meticulous work of Charles Reginald Haines, specifically his insights into Christianity and Islam in Spain during this, fascinating and often paradoxical period.
Right. So our mission today is really to uncover these profound tensions, but also the surprising coexistence that defined Spain for nearly 3 centuries. We'll look at the initial conquest, the unexpected dynamics that came out of it. Then we'll navigate through moments of really intense religious fervor and internal church debates. And finally, we'll unpack the lasting social and intellectual legacies left by both traditions. We're aiming to understand what this silent struggle truly meant for the individuals caught up in it and how it imprinted itself on the very soul of Spain. So let's start by setting the stage, historically speaking. Before the dramatic Saracen invasion, Spain was under the rule of the Visigothic kingdom.
Oh.
Its origins were quite turbulent, actually, stemming from the early 5th century. You had various Germanic tribes, the Suevi, Alani, Vandals, pouring into the Roman province. Eventually, the Visigoths asserted their dominance, particularly under powerful kings like Uric. And by 622 AD, a king named Swintila had finally succeeded in expelling all the Eastern Roman emperor's troops, really uniting Spain under single Visigothic rule.
And this Visigothic dominance brings us to a crucial religious and social context. It profoundly shaped Spain's vulnerability, you see. Initially, these Goths were Arian Christians. That's a theological stance that fundamentally differed from the Orthodox Catholicism of the Romanized people already living there. Arianism, just for clarity, asserted that Jesus was a created being, subordinate to God the Father, not co-equal within the Trinity. That was a central tenet of Orthodox Catholicism. But then a huge shift occurred in 589 AD under King Ricard de Thirst. He converted to Orthodox Catholicism, and many of his nobles and bishops eagerly followed his example. But this conversion, surprisingly, didn't bring unity. It actually ushered in an era of increased religious bigotry. Laws were enacted with escalating severity against other religions, most notably against the large Jewish population. Sigisbert, for instance, who reigned from 612 to 621, became infamous as a systematic persecutor. He forced Jews to convert under threat of severe penalties. So you have this growing religious intolerance coupled with the haughty exclusivity of the Gothic nobles who kept a distinct social hierarchy. And their deplorable treatment of the slave population, a huge segment of society, it created a deeply fractured and resentful kingdom. It's a vital backdrop because these internal weaknesses, they would prove to be profoundly destabilizing, made Spain ripe for external influence.
That internal division, it really makes you wonder, doesn't it? If some Spaniards actually welcomed the change. The Spanish historian Mariana, for instance, he boldly asserts they preferred barbarian rule over their existing Gothic one. I mean, how astonishing is that? And there are historical accounts suggesting significant internal disaffection, even outright treachery. We read about figures like Julian, a general who reportedly betrayed Ceuta, and the sons of Atiza, the late king, along with Archbishop Oppas, who later apostatized. They were all implicated in actively aiding the Arab invasion. It paints a picture of a kingdom just so internally rotten that the initial Arab conquest seemed almost effortless, swift. This context isn't just background noise. It's absolutely crucial for understanding the astonishing ease and speed with which that initial Arab conquest unfolded.
Indeed. The speed of the Arab conquests after Muhammad's death in 632 AD is truly unparalleled in world history. It's a testament to both their fervent belief and their strategic brilliance. Within just 2 years, Syria was overrun, Damascus taken. Persia, a long-standing rival to the Byzantine Empire, fell in a single decisive campaign. Jerusalem followed swiftly in 637. Then Alexandria and the fertile Nile Valley within 3 years. This relentless expansion continued right across North Africa, culminating in Tariq ibn Ziyad's momentous landing in Spain in April of 711 AD. This was unequivocally a jihad, a religious war, yes, but the early implementation of it in Spain was often surprisingly nuanced. It moved beyond simple holy violence to include, pragmatic policies.
It's so easy to fall into that traditional bloodshed and destruction narrative when thinking of conquest, but the source material really challenges that, highlighting the truly surprising leniency, even generosity, of the early Arab conquerors. Can you elaborate on what those conciliatory policies actually looked like on the ground?
Absolutely. The crucial insight here isn't just that the early Arab conquerors were lenient, but that this leniency was a highly strategic and pragmatic tool. It tells us that rapid subjugation wasn't solely about military might. It was about a sophisticated policy of governance and assimilation, a truly counterintuitive revelation when we think of traditional conquest. Consider the detailed terms of surrender. Citizens were generally allowed to keep their property, a fundamental right often stripped away in other conquests. They enjoyed freedom of religion, and crucially, their churches were left standing, protected. They even maintained their own judges and, within limits, their own laws, a remarkable degree of autonomy. Tariq ibn Ziyad himself was renowned for his clemency and even-handedness. Even more remarkably, the specific treaty of Abdulaziz with Theodomir, the Visigothic Count of Murcia, granted astonishingly favorable conditions to Christians. It ensured no captivity, active protection of churches, and only a very light tribute payment, often just 1 dinar per head annually.
So what does this all mean for our understanding of the conquest itself? It almost sounds, well, less destructive than you might expect.
Precisely. If we contrast the Arab invasion with, say, the brutal Anglo-Saxon or Norman conquests of England, where populations were often massacred or completely dispossessed, or even Charles the Great's more punitive invasion of Spain in 777, the relative mildness and pragmatism of the Saracen approach becomes strikingly clear. This conciliatory policy, rather than sheer military might alone, likely played a significant role in facilitating the swift and widespread subjugation of the country. It minimized resistance and, incentivized compliance, suggesting a focus on long-term integration rather than pure destruction.
And while the general policy leaned towards leniency, the experience on the ground could vary dramatically depending on the specific governor in charge. Some, like al-Hur ibn Abdurrahman, were indeed harsh, oppressing both Muslims and Christians, often driven by personal greed or ambition, not necessarily religious zeal. However, others, like Abdurrahman al-Ghafiqi, who famously led the Muslim forces at the Battle of Tours, were noted for dispensing equal justice to Muslims, Christians, and Jews alike. He even actively restored churches that had been illegally seized or demolished those built without proper permission. Similarly, Anbasa ibn Suhaym al-Qabi, governing from 721 to 726, was widely praised for rendering equal justice to everyone, making no distinctions based on faith or origin. This inconsistency, this sort of flux in governance, meant that stable, permanent Christian-Muslim relations couldn't truly solidify in the region. This initial period of relative tolerance and pragmatic rule certainly set the stage, but beneath the surface, profound differences and simmering tensions were undeniably growing, preparing for the next, more structured phase of the silent struggle. Right, this initial period of shifting governors and fluctuating policies eventually gave way to a new, more centralized era. It laid the groundwork for Córdoba's golden age. Spain, under the constant rotation of emirs, had been plagued by endemic instability. There were continuous, often bloody feuds between powerful Arab tribes like the Yemenite and Modherite factions. Their rivalries extended all the way from Arabia, creating deep divisions within the conquering Muslim elite. Add to this the deep-seated jealousy between the Arabs and the Berbers, who saw themselves as the true conquerors, having provided the bulk of the fighting force for Tariq, yet felt marginalized in distributing land and power. It was truly a recipe for perpetual internal conflict, hindering any stable governance.
That's a crucial point. The significance of Abdur-Mahriya's election as Caliph of Spain in May 756, it really cannot be overstated. He was a survivor of the Umayyad dynasty, nearly wiped out in the east by the Abbasids. His rival and subsequent consolidation of power in Spain, culminating in establishing an independent Umayyad dynasty, finally brought an end to the perpetual shifting of rulers. It created a new, centralized authority in Córdoba. This marked a profound shift towards greater stability and organization within the Muslim-controlled South. However, even with this strong central power, other causes of anarchy persisted. Notably, the persistent Berber rebellions born of their resentment and a devastating famine from 770 to 755. This famine, in fact, had profound demographic impact, especially in the northern frontier regions, effectively denuding them of defenders and further highlighting the fragility of the new order.
This consolidation in the south, under the new Umayyad Caliphate, led to a fascinating contrast with the north. While Abdurrahman was meticulously building his powerful empire in al-Andalus, The mountainous northern regions saw the tenacious emergence of a resilient Christian resistance. It was during this very period that figures like Pelayo, described as a descendant of the old Visigothic royal line, and a handful of patriots at Covadonga, formed the nucleus of what would become the new Spanish monarchy. Remarkably, within just 6 years of King Roderick's death, this nascent Christian power began its advance, slowly but surely regaining territory that had been lost. It was a clear signal that even as one civilization solidified its dominance, another was quietly laying the foundations for its eventual resurgence.
And alongside these grand political developments, early signs of religious strain began to surface, predating the more famous martyrdoms of Abdurrahman II's reign by decades. These were the first tremors of the silent struggle coming to the surface. One notable instance was Munusa, a governor accused by Christian chroniclers like Isidore of shedding a great deal of Christian blood, indicating not all Muslim rulers maintained that earlier leniency. Then we have the poignant case of Peter, a Christian public impost receiver in Córdoba. He recovered from a grave illness and, perhaps in a moment of profound spiritual renewal or conviction, publicly cursed Muhammad, his book, and his followers. This was no minor infraction. According to Muslim law, blasphemy against the Prophet was punishable by death, or at least scourging for milder offenses. Although his Muslim friends initially charitably attributed his outburst to his illness, his subsequent recovery and renewed condemnation, with full awareness of the consequences, led directly to his execution.
This case of Peter is incredibly significant because it's the first definite, documented indication we have that the initial Muslim toleration, which had been surprisingly mild and pragmatic, was starting to be perceived as abused by some Christian subjects. This wasn't about forced conversions or widespread persecution, but about individual Christians deliberately provoking the authorities. It laid crucial groundwork for the much larger, more public, and often self-initiated conflicts that would erupt in the coming decades, revealed a deep-seated, simmering tension that would soon boil over into outright defiance. And indeed it did boil over. During Abdurrahman II's reign, from 822 to 852 AD, a truly remarkable and, frankly, quite baffling phenomenon occurred. A sudden, fervent mania for martyrdom. It began with figures like John and Adolphus in 824 AD, who publicly professed their Christian faith and, perhaps more provocatively, denounced Muhammad. Their actions led to their swift executions. This wasn't a mass uprising, but a series of individual, deliberate provocations.
The catalyst for this surge of voluntary martyrdoms is often pinpointed to the case of Perfectus, a priest of Córdoba. He was approached by Muslims in the street, asked his opinion of their prophet. Perfectus was acutely aware of the Muslim law: scourging for cursing a Muslim, death for speaking ill of Muhammad. Initially cautious, he only spoke after receiving assurances of no harm. However, after his initial careful response, he fell ill. Upon his recovery, and perhaps in a renewed burst of spiritual conviction, he publicly cursed Muhammad, his book, and his followers again, knowing the consequences. He was subsequently executed. This wasn't isolated. We see further cases following rapidly, creating a chilling pattern. Emila and Jeremiah in September 852, Fendilla in June 853. And then Anastasius, Felix, and Digna, the latter reportedly strengthened by a celestial vision, all beheaded the very next day. Benildus, a matron, followed their defiant example just days later. Córdoba, the heart of al-Andalus, must have been a cauldron of tension and spiritual fervor.
This really gets to the heart of the silent struggle, because, as you said, these were not instances where Christians were being hunted down for their faith, unlike in some other historical periods. Instead, these were individuals who, in profound acts of zealous defiance, deliberately provoked their own condemnations by publicly blaspheming the Prophet of Islam. It was an internal, self-driven movement within a zealous segment of the Christian community, pushing the boundaries of the existing tolerance to breaking point.
The evidence, even from Christian apologists like Eulogius and Alvar, makes it clear there was no actual widespread persecution raging in Mohammedan Spain at this time that would justify such extreme reactions. The continued presence of numerous functioning churches and monasteries in and around Córdoba itself, for example, 10 to 12 monasteries and churches like St. Christopher and Tabanos, literally near the city walls, strongly indicates a significant degree of religious freedom was still afforded to Christians. This fact underscores that these martyrdoms were not a desperate response to state-sponsored oppression, but rather a strategic defiance by Christian zealots, a deliberate attempt to shock both their Muslim rulers and perhaps their fellow, more compliant Christians.
So what does this all mean for the church itself? This movement, it seems, deeply divided the Christian community, creating a profound internal conflict.
Precisely. Many high-ranking ecclesiastics, including bishops and priests, openly denounced these new martyrdoms. They were largely driven by a pragmatic fear of the dire consequences these provocative actions could bring upon the wider Christian community. Recafreitas, the Bishop of Seville, went as far as to imprison several priests who supported the movement, viewing them as dangerously radical, disruptive to the fragile peace. This clearly demonstrates the voluntary martyrdom movement was far from universally supported within the Church. In fact, the majority of ecclesiastical authorities were vehemently opposed to it. They saw it as fanaticism that jeopardized the very existence of the Christian community under Muslim rule.
And how did the Muslim authorities react to this surge of seemingly self-destructive zeal?
Their initial reaction was one of extreme alarm. King Muhammad, Abdurrahman II's successor, even contemplated a truly draconian measure: a general massacre of the male Christian population, enslavement of the women if they didn't apostatize. However, he was wisely dissuaded by his counselors. They pointed out that no men of intelligence, education, or rank among the Christians supported these zealots. They argued that punishing the entire Christian community for the actions of a few individuals who weren't directed by any unified leadership would be unjust and counterproductive. Instead, a more cunning policy of legal rigor was adopted. This wasn't mass slaughter, but a strict enforcement of existing laws against blasphemy, combined with increased scrutiny and pressure, specifically aimed at cowing them into submission and discouraging further provocations.
An illustrative example of this policy and its immediate impact is the case of Gomez, a Christian secretary who held a lucrative court office. He, along with other Christian officers, lost his coveted position due to the agitation stirred by the martyrs and the heightened Muslim scrutiny. However, Gomez quickly regained his standing by pragmatically converting to Islam. He became so ardent in his new faith he was known as the Dove of the Mosque. This demonstrates the immense pressure and the very real consequences of the period where pragmatism, fear, or opportunity could lead to conversions, not just outright persecution. The Cordovan martyrs period largely concluded with the death of Eulogius in 859, but the underlying tensions persisted. The very identity of Christians living under Muslim rule continued to evolve, giving rise to new social dynamics and further blurring the lines of the silent struggle. Right, the evolution of identities in Spain becomes even more pronounced with the rise of the Muwallids. Can you tell us who these people were and their significance within this evolving society?
The Muwallids were the new Muslims, essentially Spanish converts to Islam, or the descendants of those Christian renegades who had embraced the new faith. Despite forming a significant, perhaps even majority, part of the overall population of al-Andalus, they occupied a clear second-class status. They were looked down upon with utmost contempt by the pure-blooded Arab settlers, particularly the elite, and were generally excluded from the most lucrative and administrative posts. This inherent discrimination created fertile ground for resentment and tension within the Muslim community itself.
That sounds like a recipe for internal strife, even among the rulers themselves.
It absolutely was, and this created a fascinating, often volatile dynamic. The source tells us the unity of race prevailed over the difference of creed. This is a crucial insight. The Spanish population, whether Christian or Muslim, frequently united against the haughty exclusivity and perceived tyranny of the old Arab settlers. This inherent ethnic and cultural solidarity led to numerous Muwallid revolts across al-Andalus, for instance at Elvira, Badajoz, Merida, and Seville, often led by powerful families of Spanish origin who had converted but still felt marginalized, like the Beni Angelino and Beni Sabarico. They were fighting for their place, their rights, within the very system they had adopted.
A prime example of this complex identity shift is the incredible story of Omar ibn Hafsin. What makes his saga so compelling in understanding this period?
Omar ibn Hafsin, descended from a Gothic count, embodies this blurred identity perfectly. He began his career not as a religious leader, but as a bandit, then rose to become a powerful rebel leader, commanding a mixed force of both Muslims and Christians against the Umayyad Caliphate. His fight was initially one of regional autonomy, a challenge to Córdoban authority. However, his later conversion to Christianity, where he took the name Samuel, profoundly altered the nature of his war for national independence into a more explicitly religious struggle. This conversion, ironically, ultimately weakened his support among the Spanish Muslims who had previously allied with him against the Umayyads. They saw his cause transform from political rebellion into a religious crusade against Islam. In 928, his formidable stronghold Bobastro finally fell to the Sultan. His daughter Argentea even suffered martyrdom, choosing death over converting to Islam when she was captured. His story perfectly illustrates the intertwined nature of ethnic identity, political ambition, and religious conviction in medieval Spain.
The next major figure in this evolving landscape was Abdurrahman III, known as the Solomon of the Spanish Sultans. He inherited a country ravaged by these internal factions, Arab, Berber, Christian rebels, but through strategic brilliance and military campaigns, he largely succeeded in consolidating power, bringing a remarkable period of stability. How did he manage that, and what was its impact?
Abdurrahman III truly was a transformative figure, giving another lease of life to Arab rule in Spain. He rose to power in 912 and spent the first 2 decades of his reign systematically crushing rebellions, subduing the diverse and often unruly provinces. He rebuilt the army, reforming it to include Slavic mercenaries and Berbers, diversifying its ethnic composition to prevent further tribal feuds. His political genius was in balancing force with diplomacy, demonstrating clemency to those who submitted, and restoring internal order. He even took the prestigious title of Amir al-Mu'minin, Commander of the Faithful, in 929, signifying his claim to religious as well as political leadership, a direct challenge to the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad. This consolidation created a powerful, centralized state that allowed for an unprecedented flourishing of culture and intellect in al-Andalus.
Despite the ongoing conflicts and the clear distinctions between ruling Arabs and conquered populations, it seems the races undeniably amalgamated to a certain extent under Abdurrahman III's reign and before it. Intermarriage, for instance, became remarkably common.
Indeed, the blurring of lines was evident early on. Roderick's widow, Edgelona, married Abdelaziz, the first Arab governor of Spain. The sons of Ventesas, the last Visigothic king, also married Arab women, signaling a pragmatic strategy to secure their status and property. These weren't isolated incidents. Even Abdurrahman III himself was the son of a Christian slave named Maria, meaning the greatest ruler of al-Andalus had Christian ancestry. And the formidable Al-Mansur, who would rule Spain at the height of its power later in the 10th century, had a Christian renegade as his grandmother. These are just a few prominent instances that underscore how common this intermingling became at all levels of society, from the lowest ranks to the highest echelons of power.
And this leads us to a point of historical debate that's particularly intriguing and frankly quite unsettling, the maiden tribute. What exactly was the supposed tribute?
The maiden tribute, a fascinating and controversial historical detail. This refers to the supposed yearly tribute of 100 maidens paid by northern Christian kings to earlier Arab sultans of Córdoba. Modern historians often cast doubt on this story, primarily due to a lack of explicit mention in the very earliest Christian chronicles. However, the source indicates that an Arab writer, Omar ibn al-Haftas al-Mudaffar, who was king of Algarve, explicitly mentions this tribute in a letter from 1086. He reminded Alfonso VI of his forefathers offering homage even of their own daughters. This is a significant piece of evidence from an Arab perspective.
And this is where the evidence becomes even more compelling for its existence. The maiden tribute is the subject of several ancient, widely circulated ballads by Christian Spaniards, which, given their nature, would likely not fabricate something so demeaning to their own people. Furthermore, while it might not appear in the earliest Christian chronicles, a document included in the collection of Flores, attributed to Romero, a Christian king, directly alludes to it. It states, "Our ancestors, to free themselves from the raids of the Saracens, consented to pay them yearly a shameful tribute of 100 maidens." This document even claims the practice continued for over 50 years, ceasing only after a miraculous victory. While debated, the overall weight of this evidence strongly suggests this was no mere myth, but a deeply humiliating yet perhaps pragmatically accepted historical practice.
Regardless of whether the tribute was entirely literal or perhaps symbolic in some instances, its presence in both Arab accounts and Christian historical consciousness, it speaks volumes about the power dynamics and cultural exchange occurring. Most of these Christian maidens, once given over, would likely have converted to Islam upon marriage, becoming part of Muslim households. However, it is equally plausible that some may have subtly influenced their husband's faith or contributed to the cultural and intellectual blending observed in later centuries. This illustrates a profound, albeit often coercive, two-way street of conversion and influence. It reflects just how deeply intertwined these societies became. As cultures intertwined in such complex ways, so too did ideas, leading to fascinating and sometimes controversial shifts in religious understanding and practice within both Christianity and Islam.
As you can imagine, with such close and prolonged contact, there were profound mutual misunderstandings between Christians and Muslims regarding each other's core beliefs. For instance, Muslims often fundamentally misperceived the Christian Trinity. They viewed it not as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, but rather as God, Christ, Mary. Wow. This misinterpretation likely stemmed from the deep reverence paid to the Virgin Mary within Christian practice, especially among Roman Catholics even then, leading to confusion between veneration and worship.
And this misunderstanding wasn't limited to the Trinity. Consider the Muslim view of St. James, or Santiago, who became the patron saint of Spain, an iconic rallying point for the Christian Reconquista. The Arab historian Ibn Hayyan describes his shrine at Compostela as a Kaaba of Mecca. He refers to the colossal statue of the saint within as an idol, highlighting their fundamental misunderstanding of Christian veneration of saints and relics. They noted Christians swore by it and made arduous pilgrimages from distant lands, believing the tomb housed James, one of the apostles. This was a concept they struggled to reconcile with their own strict monotheism and aniconism, the prohibition against images.
This raises an important question. How did these close yet often misinformed contacts affect doctrinal development within Christianity itself? Did these cross-cultural interactions lead to new interpretations or even heresies as a form of adaptation?
They certainly did lead to modifications, though it's important to stress that no complete midway religion emerged. Instead, we can trace some subtle Islamic influences in various Christian heresies that arose in Spain during this period, suggesting a form of theological osmosis. For example, a minor heresy in Septimania, Gothic Gaul, likely in the 8th century, argued for the denial of priestly confession. Asserted confession should be directly to God alone. While modern Protestants might find this idea laudable, it was considered favorable to libertinage at the time, as it potentially lessened accountability. Its resonance with Quran verses, such as, "Take not the other for lords beside God," which emphasizes direct worship of Allah, suggests a possible, though unprovable, influence of Islamic emphasis on direct communion with God. Another example is Megesius's corporeal trinity around 750 AD, which viewed the Father as David, the Son as Jesus, and the Holy Ghost as Paul. This rather crude attempt to personify the Trinity was likely an effort to make the complex concept more comprehensible, perhaps in a theological environment emphasizing divine unity, a core Islamic tenet, where the nuanced nature of the Trinity was often a point of contention.
And this next point is truly fascinating. The famous adoptionist heresy. This was a far more prominent and controversial doctrine, and there's a significant debate over its originators, primarily Elipandus, the Bishop of Toledo, and Felix, the Bishop of Urgel. Many eminent writers on church history, including Mariana and Baronius, even believed its ultimate object was to lower the character of Christ, to pave the way for a grand union between Christians and Mohammedans.
The core of adoptionism was this: Christ, in his deity, is truly God. But in his manhood, he is Son of God by adoption only, or in a nuncupative sense. To elaborate on that specific theological term, nuncupative means nominally, or by declaration, rather than by nature or essence. So the adoptionists argued that while the divine Christ was eternally begotten, the human Christ was adopted by God, an act of grace rather than inherent divine status in his human form. Felix, who bore the chief onus of defense against heresy accusations, aimed to clarify that the predicates of Christ's two natures, divine and human, could not be logically interchanged without causing theological confusion. He argued Christ, as man, and in respect to that humanity, was Son of God only in this nuncupative sense, a relationship he termed adoption. The theory suggests this doctrine, by emphasizing Christ's humanity and implicitly reducing the perceived defense of his full divinity, might have been an attempt, perhaps even unconscious, to conciliate Mohammedan opinion, bridge the theological chasm. This doctrine was vehemently condemned by various church councils across Europe, indicating its profound controversial nature. Yet it perhaps represents an unwitting adaptation to the prevailing religious thought of a dominant culture.
An illustrative example of this free air of Spain, where such independent theological views could take root, is the figure of Claudius of Turin. A Spanish disciple of the adoptionist Felix, Claudius later became a bishop in Italy. He was a radical iconoclast, famously destroying images and crosses in his bishopric, which strongly reflects the Muslim iconoclastic tendencies prohibiting image veneration. He also held remarkably independent views on papal supremacy, famously refusing to attend a council seeking to condemn him. Instead, he called the proposed assembly a congregation of asses. He boldly argued true apostolic authority does not belong to one who fills the see of an apostle, but who fulfills the duties thereof, directly challenging the Pope's singular claim to spiritual authority by virtue of his office alone. He also questioned the efficacy of Roman pilgrimages, stating eternal life couldn't be gained by a mere journey to Rome, highlighting highlighting a disdain for external rites in favor of internal piety, much like some Islamic thought. This demonstrates how living under Muslim rule, where papal supremacy was impossible in practice, fostered a spirit of ecclesiastical independence and critical theological thinking less constrained by Roman dogma.
Moving to the reverse influence, it's clear the social and intellectual impact of Christianity had a kind of disintegrating effect on some traditional Islamic social institutions and practices in Spain. For instance, we see a gradual abandonment of traditional Muslim dress. The turban, once a highly significant symbol of Muslim identity and piety, eventually was only worn by faqihs, or legal scholars, versed in Islamic law, highlighting a shift in broader societal markers and a departure from more rigid customs.
And it extended to art and sculpture, where the strict Islamic prohibition against representing living creatures, a key tenet elsewhere in the Muslim world, was conspicuously disregarded in al-Andalus. The source mentions a statue of Abdurrahman III's wife, Zahra, in his opulent palace, which would have been scandalous in other Islamic courts. We also see animal images on fountains and even a lion on an aqueduct within Córdoba. This artistic freedom, allowing for representation and aesthetic flourish, suggests a profound cultural assimilation of Christian artistic traditions and a relaxation of religious prescriptions strictly observed in the Eastern Caliphates.
Beyond visual arts, there were also shifts in worship practices. Women, contrary to Muslim law elsewhere, were explicitly admitted into mosques in Spain. This was a significant departure from typical practice in other Islamic lands, where women were generally expected to perform devotions at home or visit mosques only when men weren't present, often in segregated sections. This acceptance of women within public religious spaces suggests a greater openness, influenced by the more mixed social norms prevalent in a Christian-majority historical context. Even the direction of prayer seems to have been influenced. Some Spanish Arabs apparently abandoned the tradition of turning strictly towards Mecca, as evidenced by Abu Ubaidah being given the rather pointed nickname Sahibul Qibla, literally master of the Qibla, for actually doing so. This implies that for many, facing Mecca during prayer had become a less rigidly observed custom, suggesting a subtle, almost unconscious cultural adaptation to their new Iberian environment. Perhaps most profoundly, we see a refinement of the concept of love, moving beyond what was considered gross sensuality in more traditional Arab societies. A poem by Said ibn Judi to his ideal mistress, Jahama, uses language that might be those of a Provençal troubadour, breathing the delicateness of Christian chivalry. And Ali ibn Hazm, a prime minister of Christian ancestry, describes love as something pure, something delicate, something spiritual, which was not Arab, strongly suggesting the assimilation of Christian chivalric ideals and notions of romantic love into the Muslim elite.
This cultural exchange was truly a two-way street, wasn't it? A testament to the depth of the silent struggle. While Islam adapted to its new surroundings, Christianity also showed clear signs of absorbing elements from its dominant counterpart, even if perhaps less profoundly in certain areas.
One indisputable example is that many Christians, including some bishops, submitted to be circumcised. It's unclear whether this was solely to pass as Muslims due to direct societal or economic pressure, or for other reasons. But Alvar, a Christian apologist, condemned it as explicitly adopting the pestilent ways of the Gentiles and neglecting circumcision of the heart in favor of an outward sign of Muslim identity. Some Christians also began to abstain from certain meats, similar to Muslim dietary practices, particularly pork, forbidden in Islam. One bishop even excused this compliance as necessary for peaceful coexistence, though stricter parties within the church viewed it with considerable alarm as a compromise of Christian identity. Furthermore, we see the rise of chivalric ideals among Moorish knights, emphasizing piety, courtesy, prowess, eloquence, poetry, horsemanship virtues resonating strongly with Christian notions of knighthood. Moorish kings even began conferring knighthood on their vassals after the Christian fashion, borrowing specific ceremonies and traditions, reflecting a mutual respect for these martial virtues.
A compelling example of this blending of virtues is the legendary magnanimity and justice of Almanzor, even if some stories are romanticized in ballads. One chronicler explicitly states Almanzor held justice dearer than any Christian. Stories abound of him showing profound mercy on the battlefield, releasing prisoners of war without ransom, even sending lavish wedding gifts to Christian enemies like the Count of Castile, despite being at war. While some might be anecdotal, they consistently portray a figure embodying virtues valued by both faiths. suggesting a profound cross-cultural appreciation for certain ethical standards and a shared understanding of noble conduct, even across religious divides. This constant negotiation of identities and practices played out not just in daily life, but also in the broader political and religious landscape, particularly concerning the ultimate authority of the Church. Which brings us to the long game of Spain and its evolving relationship with papal power. Historically, the Spanish Church held a remarkable degree of independence before the Arab conquest. We see this in towering figures like Josias of Córdoba, who famously presided over the major councils of Nice in 325 and Sardica in 347, indicating its high standing and doctrinal influence in the early Christian world. It truly was a church with its own distinct identity.
Absolutely. The Arian Gothic rule, which isolated Spain from the rest of Catholic Europe for centuries, further fostered this independence by effectively cutting off regular communication with Rome. Even after the Goths converted to Orthodox Catholicism under Rocaire I, papal claims were still strenuously resisted on key points. For instance, the purchase of dispensations from Rome, special permissions or exemptions from canon law, was expressly forbidden by Spanish councils. And papal infallibility, far from being accepted dogma, was by no means a given. The prelates of Spain famously defended Bishop Julian against the strictures of Pope Benedict II. Benedict's successor, John V, later conceded the Spanish bishops had been correct in their theological stance. There's even some suggestion that Witiza, the very last Gothic king, explicitly forbade appeals to Rome just before the Saracen invasion, highlighting this deeply entrenched tradition of ecclesiastical autonomy.
But here's a truly surprising and profoundly ironic turn. The Arab domination, though initially a catastrophic setback for Spanish Christianity, paradoxically became the main cause of its ultimate subjection to papal authority. How did that happen?
This is a critical long-term effect of the silent struggle. The Christian church in the north, clinging to precarious footholds, constantly under threat from the powerful Caliphate of Córdoba, was in a position of great danger and weakness. Naturally, they looked for external help and validation. Since the Franks, their closest Christian neighbors, consistently pursued a self-serving policy focused on expanding their temporal dominion rather than acting as genuine altruistic champions of Spanish Christianity. The beleaguered Spanish Christians increasingly turned to the only Christian ruler who could offer consistent moral, spiritual, and eventually material assistance, the Pope in Rome. This created a profound opportunity for the popes to gradually establish and then consolidate their authority over the Spanish Church. They ingeniously leveraged the Reconquista, transforming it from a series of local skirmishes into a grand crusade endorsed by the Holy See. This endorsement came with powerful incentives. For example, offering indulgences like exemption from purgatory for a mere 200 maravedis a head, which, over 4 years, famously raised millions for the Roman treasury, directly funding the papal agenda and solidifying Rome's influence.
A significant moment in this process of growing papal influence was the miraculous discovery of St. James's body in 808 AD. This event prompted Alfonso, the Asturian king, to appeal to the Pope to move the see of Ira Flavia to Santiago de Compostela. This act is often seen as the birth of the new Spanish Church, but it also hints at the increasing papal influence over what had been a fiercely independent Christian tradition. Yet the resistance to Rome was still palpable in some corners, even amidst the Arab rule.
Indeed. Despite the growing trend, figures like Claudius of Turin, a Spaniard and disciple of the adoptionist Felix, exemplify this enduring internal tension regarding Rome's burgeoning power. Claudius, far from passively accepting papal claims, famously resisted them. He argued true apostolic authority does not belong to one who fills the see of an apostle, but who fulfills the duties thereof, directly challenging the Pope's singular claim to spiritual authority merely by occupying Peter's seat. He questioned the very spiritual efficacy of Roman pilgrimages, stating eternal life could not be gained by a mere journey to Rome. He saw such external rituals as empty without true inner piety. This reveals a continuation of the earlier Spanish Church's independent spirit, fostered partly by centuries of operating under Muslim rule, where papal supremacy was, in practical terms, impossible to enforce, allowing indigenous theological currents and a more decentralized view of church authority to flourish.
Yet once its authority was recognized, the Pope's interference in Spain seems to have rapidly increased, almost like a snowball effect.
Exactly. The shift was stark. Kings could no longer call councils without a papal bull, meaning direct permission from Rome, a significant loss of royal autonomy over church affairs. Pope Adrian I, in the late 8th century, actively intervened against magician errors in Spain, demonstrating Rome's willingness to directly dictate theological orthodoxy across the Pyrenees. His interventions included strong denunciations of intermarriage with Jews and Muslims, concerns about unqualified priests, and general exhortations to return to strict Roman Catholic practice. This shows Rome actively extending its reach, not just spiritually, but into the very social fabric of Spanish Christian life.
And yet, even with this increasing pressure, resistance continued. Elipandus, the primate of Spain, while refuting the magician errors as the Pope wished, also boldly challenged the Pope's authority on other fronts. How did he manage that?
Elipandus, in a remarkable display of independent thought, directly pushed back against Roman imposition. He rejected specific dietary restrictions Rome was attempting to impose, like abstaining from pork or strangled things, viewing them as unnecessary legalisms. Most significantly, he famously argued Christ's words to Peter, "Thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church," applying to the whole church, not just to Rome or the Pope. This was a profound theological challenge to the very foundation of papal supremacy. To further underscore his point, he even cited Liberius as a heretic pope, a powerful and daring move directly challenging the notion of Roman infallibility, suggesting the Pope could indeed err in matters of faith. This intellectual defiance was a testament to the distinct theological tradition that had developed in Spain, one that valued autonomy and a broader interpretation of Christian authority. In conclusion, it's a powerful paradox. Had Arab rule encompassed all of Spain and continued indefinitely, it's highly probable Spain would never become the priest-ridden country it later did. The continuous and gradual reconquest by Christian kingdoms in the north, precisely because of their weakness and desperate need for external validation and consistent support against a formidable Muslim foe, led to an ever-increasing subservience to the Pope. This subjection manifested in various ways, from the gradual but relentless suppression of the traditional Mozarabic rite, the unique, ancient form of Christian worship in Spain, in favor of the Roman rite, to direct papal control over royal marriages and church appointments, even the naming of bishops. This historical trajectory, initiated by the silent struggle, ultimately culminated in the grim reality of the Inquisition, an institution that would enforce a singular, unwavering Catholic orthodoxy with chilling efficiency.
And this brings us to the very shadow of the Inquisition, a poignant illustration of the ultimate outcome of these centuries of struggle and evolving religious power dynamics. The Spanish Inquisition, established initially against converted Jews, then against the Moriscos, Muslims under Christian rule, often forced to convert, and later Protestants, became the ultimate enforcer of rigid Roman Catholic dominance.
The statistics are truly chilling, a testament to its effectiveness in suppressing dissenting doctrines and enforcing a homogeneous faith. In one particularly dark year, 2,000 people were martyred, and an additional 17,000 suffered punishments short of death, ranging from public flogging to imprisonment and property confiscation. Under Torquemada's 18-year administration alone, over 10,000 people were burned at the stake, and nearly 100,000 were reconciled, a euphemism for forced conversion or compliance, often involving severe penalties and seizure of wealth. This systematic oppression and confiscation of property brought enormous sums into the inquisitors' coffers, making it a powerful and self-sustaining institution. It's a stark, almost unimaginable contrast to the early Spanish Church's historical independence and the nuanced religious coexistence, however fragile, seen in earlier periods of al-Andalus. The vibrant intellectual life and the theological fluidity marking those centuries were now systematically extinguished.
This offers a truly poignant reflection on how the silent struggle for Spain's soul ultimately culminated not in a harmonious blending, but in a rigid conformity, tragically extinguishing the very intellectual and social vibrancy that marked earlier periods of interfaith contact, replacing it with a singular and forced doctrine. Okay, let's unpack this then. The story of Christianity and Islam in medieval Spain is far richer, more complex, and certainly more surprising than a simple narrative of conqueror and conquered. It was a centuries-long deep dive into cultural exchange, religious adaptation, and profound social transformation.
We've seen how initial leniency gave way to religious provocation, how identities blurred and reformed, and how both faiths, in their own unique ways, absorbed and resisted the influence of the other. The silent struggle wasn't about total victory or absolute defeat, but about a constant dynamic negotiation of beliefs and practices, often at a deeply personal and societal level, leaving an indelible mark.
So what does this all mean for us today? This historical period serves as a powerful reminder that even in profound conflict, cultures intertwine in unexpected ways. Human ingenuity, curiosity, and even defiance find ways to flourish, leaving behind complex legacies that continue to shape the world long after the immediate conflict has passed.
It raises an important question for us to consider. When civilizations meet and intermingle for centuries is true. Complete assimilation ever truly possible without significant compromise to core identity? Or does every interaction, whether through conquest or coexistence, leave an indelible, complex mark that transcends simple binaries, forever changing both sides?
We hope this deep dive into Cross and Crescent has offered you a fresh perspective on a pivotal period in history, and perhaps inspired you to explore the fascinating, forgotten, and sometimes forbidden texts and narratives that lie beneath the surface of familiar stories.